Now, a big thing occurs in November of 2013. I had gone out to a restaurant across the street from the hotel. I had sat down at the bar. My iPhone 4 is with me, sitting on the bar, and I ended up hanging out with three Ukrainian Americans who I had already known over the course of the previous year while staying at the hotel. And we had spoken about Russia, Soviet Union, Ukraine, even topics like Holodomor, and communism, capitalism, the financial system, and who fundamentally controlled the planet. We had spoken, probably for 3 hours between 8 that evening until about 11:30 at the latest. I had gone back to the hotel and went to sleep. The very next morning, CNBC is thrown on the TV. CNBC, prior to this entire affair, would only talk about billionaires, millionaires, corporate America, Wall Street, the stock market, currencies, that kind of stuff. But they would never delve into domestic social issues or foreign policy issues, conflicts, issues like that. So on the television, they're talking about these protests that have now begun the very next day, Thursday morning in late November 2013. This is a week before Thanksgiving, about these protests called the Euromaidan Protests occurring in Kiev, Ukraine. So given the fact that my iPhone 4 was sitting on the bar, given the fact that for over a year, basically a year and a half, close to it, I have known that I have been put under surveillance by my own free and democratic government. And everyone can essentially not only see what I'm doing on my phone, but they can also see me and hear me. So essentially they're receiving live video, almost like a FaceTime call, a video call, through the front-facing and even rear-facing camera on the iPhone, on the MacBook, the front-facing camera, and also the microphone. And I, at this point, certainly suspected that the iPhone 4 was also hacked because of these protests coincidentally occurring the very next day. Given the fact that Ukraine is about 8 or so hours ahead of the East Coast of the United States, Eastern Standard Time, these protests essentially commenced only hours after that conversation that I had with these three guys in the restaurant. So, the timing is rather remarkable, but at the same time, I don't have any idea that iPhones can get hacked. At the time, I'm not particularly tech savvy. At this point, I deeply suspected my iPhone 4 was also hacked, and it could certainly pick up sound through the microphone due to these Euromaidan protests. I deeply suspected this was the CIA at work, and they had been planning these protests. Essentially a color revolution, yet another color revolution in Eastern Europe, perhaps with the support of Open Society Foundation. And eventually it was disclosed that Victoria Nuland and the State Department played a large role in manufacturing these protests months before. If the State Department is involved, certainly the CIA is involved. In March of 2014, a very, very big moment occurs for me personally. While I'm watching CNBC during the day, mid-March 2014, a supposed reporter, actually a propagandist at CNBC, one of the many, came on air and started to talk about some story. In that story, she slid in a comment that was directed at myself. This is happening on live television. This is actually how many things would happen, but nothing was so direct, that is specifically targeting me, until this event. The propagandist's name is Seema Mody. She was on air and it was a three-way split screen with Julia Boorstein on the left, middle Kayla Tausche, and on the right side was Seema Mody. Now, Julia Boorstein is located on the West Coast. She deals with the rest of corporate mainstream media, the movie industry and television industry. Seema mentions this thing about me, and I had said out loud, into the MacBook. The MacBook is sitting right in front of me. That's not true. And I start to try to figure out who could have told Seema this lie. And after about 10 seconds, the name Ronak Shah pops into my head. I immediately Google Ronak Shah, who is someone that I know from my personal life, and I'll get into that in a moment. I find an interview that Ronak is doing with, guess who? CNBC. And this was only a recent interview that was posted, I believe, on YouTube. I had grown up with Ronak, and I had done, there was a situation where when we were kids, he was getting teased, getting picked on by a bunch of Boy Scouts. He had joined the Boy Scouts, and I was in the Boy Scouts at the time. And the rest of the troop had started making fun of him because he is Ronak, just the way he looks and the way he talks. He is a remarkable human being. He's a year younger than me. I believe I was maybe 12 years old at the time. He's Indian, and I just kind of felt bad for him. Everyone in the troop is making fun of him, and he starts to cry. And even the troop masters, our chaperones essentially, are laughing as well. And I just felt terrible. So I basically yelled at the entire Boy Scout troop, and got them to quit making fun of Ronak. And the poor kid was like hyperventilating, and he couldn't even breathe. He was crying so much. He couldn't catch his breath. And so by this time he had walked off, and I, walked over to him, put my arm around him, and just basically comforted the kid, because, that's not a comfortable situation to go through. We were on a camping trip, so it's not like as if his mom could pick him up or anything. So he had to spend the rest of the weekend with us. And so I basically stayed with him. And so in a matter of 30 to 45 seconds, I typed up this story. And in the meantime, Seema Mody, Kayla Tausche, they think this story is true. And they're actually still laughing while I am typing this up, and I hit enter. So when I hit enter, all these guys at CNBC, they had a team dedicated just to see what I was posting and when I was posting it, so they could quickly use it for their own programming. I suspected the corporate mainstream media outlets, not only CNBC, but CNN and the rest, had already known who I was, because the CIA informed them of my identity, going back to the summer of 2013, shortly after Edward Snowden. So sometime around June or July, was when they already knew who I actually was. And when I hit that enter button, the producers, the directors, those in the control room had said to Seema Mody and Kayla Tausche in their earpieces, Sri knows who told you guys that story, who told Seema that story, which was not true. And at that moment, Seema's face, her jaw, Kayla Tausche's, basically just dropped on air. And they didn't say a word. They were speechless. It was essentially dead silence for maybe 10 to 15 seconds on air. Julia Boorstein, being out on the West Coast, did not know what was going on. So she's kind of like smiling, but she doesn't really know who I am. She's not really involved in the matter because this entire matter was being conducted on the part of CNBC at their headquarters in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. So this was an embarrassing moment for CNBC, not only Seema or Kayla, but all of CNBC. So even the anchors like Brian Sullivan or Sara Eisen, or perhaps even a clown cheerleader of Wall Street like Jim Cramer, Carl Quesadilla, David Faber, Joe Kernen, Becky Quick, Andrew Sorkin. It was embarrassing for the entire company. This was a critically important event for myself because Ronak actually grew up with my brother. They get along great. They are very, very close friends. So when I got this correct, and I knew I was correct, when the name pops up in my head and I find that video and I type out this whole thing without even a single typo, just boom, within seconds, post it. These clowns at CNBC have egg all over their face. I also realize that my own brother Anil already knows about what's going on in the hotel. And I suspected this went back as far as the summer of 2013. We are now in March of 2014. In between the Euromaidan protests commencing in November of 2013 and this point, in March of 2014, I had convinced the CIA and Barack Obama to back off of Russia while they were putting up the referendum vote for the Crimean people to decide whether they wanted to remain with Ukraine or rejoin Russia. And at this time, the CIA was hell-bent on starting World War III with Russia and Iran. And so this takes care of one. And I begged them, pleaded them not to do this. And they finally relented. And I had allowed Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, to be able to put everything up to a vote and allow Russia to essentially take Crimea and make it a part of the Russian nation state once again. There is a lot going on at the time. There is a lot on my plate. So I've got a lot to deal with in the hotel room, but my own brother, Anil, actually was already informed of what had been going on up until then. So for the past 2 years or so, nearly 2 years in that hotel. And even going back to 2010 when I was originally put under surveillance by Josh and Larry. So this was a big, big event because I had not really told anyone close to me what was going on. When I am in the hotel, this is a prime opportunity for the CIA to escalate this surveillance because I had essentially cut ties with all of my family, my friends. It is just me, the MacBook, the iPhone, in that hotel room. My stock accounts, obviously CNBC running on the television. So at this point, the CIA is kind of screwed. Josh is screwed. Larry is screwed. Ronak is screwed as well. But so are the television networks besides CNBC, such as CNN, Comedy Central, Jon Stewart, Bill Maher at HBO. Up until this point, I had told strangers just to see if people would believe the story, and each and every time, the individual or individuals would believe the story. They would be shocked by it. They would tell me, get the hell out of the hotel, you've got to get a lawyer, this and that, and I would respond with, this is the CIA. Josh's dad is a very big person on Wall Street. Back in those days, I would say he was easily one of the 3 biggest guys on Wall Street. And back in 99, when, this is many years ago, I had said, I predict that Larry will become the single biggest individual on Wall Street and in the entire world when it comes to the financial sector. So there are now 2 individuals besides Josh who can independently corroborate, validate, confirm to any journalist that my story is indeed true. Despite how unprecedented it might be, it's true. And going forward, when it comes to Donald Trump and a variety of other matters that I will be talking about in a bit, including the Iran nuclear deal, the Cuban thaw, basically controlling Barack Obama's White House policies, and in particular, CIA policy. And on top of that, the news stories that were being promoted by these propaganda outlets in the United States, all of that can now be corroborated by not only my brother, but Ronak as well. So going forward, in May of 2014, the Indian elections were going on and Indians were going to vote on a new prime minister, either Narendra Modi representing the BJP or Rahul Gandhi representing the Congress Party, which has essentially remained in power since 1947. I had spoken about this election and I had essentially lent my support to Modi and the BJP because I have Gujarati friends in the United States who had told me back in 2006 that Modi was actually a pretty good chief minister for the state of Gujarat. And I had done my own research at the time as well, as I normally do, and figured the same. The journalism isn't great in India, but I had a feeling that at least there would be a possibility for economic growth and for the poor to be properly considered if Modi were elected. Even beyond that, I had already been giving the CIA suggestions, advice with regards to India. So it didn't matter who was going to be elected between the 2 of them as the next prime minister. I had told the CIA and Barack Obama White House to befriend the next prime minister even before the election had ended and Modi was eventually elected. I had suggested that Barack Obama or the CIA to essentially encourage this new prime minister to start building cities with proper sewer lines, essentially cleaning up the cities that already exist and building new cities as well. So this was an idea that would eventually be called smart cities. This was the idea, the original idea for a new capital for Andhra Pradesh, which would later be called Amaravathi by Chandrababu Naidu. Actually came from me. On top of that, after the election, I had said that Barack Obama should befriend Prime Minister Modi. I was personally sick and tired of how the United States treated India. Since independence, the United States chose Pakistan as a useful idiot. Probably a good thing for India. However, I know that the CIA assassinated Prime Minister Lal Shastri and India's nuclear scientist, Homi Baba, in 1966. I had always suspected it, and recently, only 2 or 3 years ago, it was actually confirmed by someone in the CIA by the name of William Crowley. And the United States artificially suppressed the Indian economy and intentionally devalued its currency, going back to independence, particularly after the 1965, the immigration revisions to visa guidelines with respect to Asia in general, but in particular India. So I gave a bunch of suggestions of advice. I told Barack Obama, you've got to become friends with this guy. I'm sick and tired of this crap. With India, you guys kept the country poor after the British took everything. from India with the financiers, who I'm largely avoiding talking about in this video, but you can look them up. The Rothschild family, Warburgs, they belong to a specific tribe, the same tribe that controls American corporate mainstream media. Now, in this video, I'm going to largely avoid this topic, but I certainly will be talking about this and why there was this constant back and forth between myself and CNBC, why CNN got involved, everyone, Comedy Central, HBO, etc., because these guys at CNBC and all these corporate mainstream media networks are extraordinarily ignorant. They don't belong in the news industry. They don't know anything. And so I would always have to kind of provide proof for the statements I was making, in particular with regards to globalism, Zionism, Israhell, the genocide of Palestinians, the kind of Jewish supremacism that exists in not only America, but Europe, and of course, Israhell. You can clearly see it with American foreign policy. So I would always have to corroborate everything for them. And each and every time they would always have egg on their face. And so going back to late 2012, it ended up becoming very contentious between myself and all these media outlets, with the CIA essentially managing the situation. So all of this I will explain down the road when I do come forward. I was obviously frustrated given the fact that I know my history, I know Indian history, I know American history, I understand geopolitics, I know quite a bit. So it was actually me. I was the reason. And many can corroborate this down the road, including my own brother, Ronak, everyone at CNBC, that's for sure, including the clown, Seema Mody, amongst the many, many other clowns at CNBC that participated in this psyop. It was actually because of me why Barack Obama reached out to Modi, invited him to the White House later that year, I believe August of 2014, and why there developed this kind of friendship between the United States and India. Modi, of course, thought he was an amazing guy. Nobody in India actually knows about me. Nobody in the BJP was ever informed about me. Because if they were, then they would not be the useful idiots that they eventually became over the years. Another idea I came up with the week after the election had ended and Modi was elected was to implement a small federal tax, national tax, which eventually became known as the GST, Goods and Services Tax, on every shampoo bottle, soap, AC, television that was sold in the country. And what I had said was, at the time there were 1.3 billion Indians. I just basically asked rhetorically, can you imagine how much money that would provide for schools, hospitals, research programs, universities, scholarship programs, to send the best students abroad for advanced degrees, roads. So that eventually was implemented, but unfortunately for shampoo and soap, the tax was 18%. This was done after Donald Trump was elected. 18% on shampoo and whatever. I had asked for a very, very small tax on the shampoo and soap and personal care products. I had imagined something like 5%, no larger than 7%. Even 8% is a lot. And the reason why is because so many people in India are poor. So when it comes to air conditioners and televisions, you can jack up the tax to something like 18%. When it comes to cars, automobiles, you can jack up the tax even further. But all of this ended up getting sabotaged. It was all fully controlled by the United States. Modi there are so many ideas that I provided that Modi ended up implementing through the counseling of the United States government that I was actually the brains behind. These were actually my ideas. And I had spat them out, in the weeks leading up to the election or immediately after that election had ended. So the week after, 2 weeks after, it was done. I had just thrown a slew of ideas for India to improve economically. These were just small things that the prime minister could easily do and could clean up the tax code. Another thing that I mentioned was the grafting in the country, to get rid of it, to basically penalize it, to punish it. Also, the grafting that had already occurred in the past, and so many politicians had basically enriched themselves over the decades, and I knew about black money and where it was sitting. So I said to target foreign banks. I did not go into detail because I was throwing out so many ideas in rapid succession during those days. My priority was always the United States and improving the American economy and saving the Black American and white American populations that had built the United States in the first place. My priority was not really India. However, me being Indian as well as American, I figured with the amount of power that I had at the time, I should probably help India out a little bit, knowing that the United States did not care one bit about India otherwise. So I felt that I could use this situation to start a new era between India and US. Yet another way, the US rolled out the red carpet for Narendra Modi, who thought he was simply an amazing human being, and that's why the United States was treating him so well, was Congress inviting Narendra Modi to speak to all congressmen in the US in Capitol Hill, giving him the floor for a speech. This was an idea of mine, a request of mine, about a week or two after the election, after bringing up the idea for the US to do a 180 on the past 70 or so years of US-India relations, and also after bringing up perhaps it might be a good idea for India and Israhell to establish economic ties. I had mentioned that whenever Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel ever wanted to speak to Congress in the United States, that is, at Capitol Hill, he was always given the opportunity. Unfortunately, Benjamin Netanyahu would only do this and waste the time of US lawmakers in order to sell a conflict with Persia, always claiming that Iran was 7 days or 30 days away from attaining nuclear weapons, which is absolutely absurd. Anybody that knows Iran, anybody that knows what's going on in the world, understands if Iran ever wanted to create nuclear weapons, it could have a long time ago. With that, I had convinced the CIA to perhaps give Modi the opportunity to speak to the American Congress. Now, this was an idea that finally came to fruition about 2 years later during the 2016 presidential election. It took a while, and I had not brought it up thereafter. So this was something that the CIA remembered themselves, and because of my cooperation in that election, they decided to go with it. Not only that, I mentioned to Barack Obama that, look, you already went to India back in 2010 when Manmohan Singh was prime minister. I want you to visit India once more. I want you to also visit the Taj Mahal. Barack Obama eventually did do that, I believe in January of 2015, but that trip was cut short because the king of Saudi Arabia had passed, and Saudi Arabia is Saudi Arabia, a very important ally to the United States, and in particular the CIA. So he cut his trip short and had to head to Riyadh in order to attend the funeral. That's a matter that I will discuss down the road as well. I will discuss all these things in detail down the road. I also suggested that India and Israel begin an economic partnership. Because of me, there started this relationship. This relationship started between Benjamin Netanyahu and Narendra Modi, and unfortunately, because of the constant back and forth between myself and the media outlets, the CIA made an idiotic decision and started using India, that is Modi, a really useful idiot for the United States and Israel over the years. You'll understand why when you make it to the end of this video. Pretty much immediately in that summer, there was this weapons deal where India unnecessarily purchased Israeli weapons. There was all this corruption immediately with Modi and Anil Ambani, Mukesh Ambani, really the Gujarati billionaire segment of India. All of the power that Modi had, political power, he used it to essentially begin consolidating economic power within the state of Gujarat. He targeted really the Ambani brothers. Everything really started going downhill, unfortunately, because Modi and the BJP, these are essentially Hindu nationalists, the Hindutva stuff, and it was a good thing in the beginning to instill pride in Hindus, because Hindus are so pacifist and they're such nice people. Unfortunately, the world does not work that way, and people will take advantage of you. And that is precisely what happened over many centuries, unfortunately. And so that Hindu nationalism, that religious zealotry, was essentially hijacked by the CIA and United States and weaponized going forward. Now, I will talk about this later after Donald Trump gets elected. So even HBO was involved, Bill Maher and Waldo, otherwise known as John Oliver. His first season starts in April of 2014. You guys can watch that first season. From the very first episode, I had a heavy amount of influence over his show. I can talk about that another time. Waldo is an extraordinarily insignificant human being, so it's not worth my time in this video. So after that election, what ends up happening, because I embarrassed Seema Mody and CNBC live on air, there will be live footage of this in the CNBC archives. The CIA mistakenly transferred quite an amount of influence and control over this PSYOP to CNBC, to the very same group of 5 or 6 guys whose job it was to sit there and watch me all day, every day, 24/7, week after week, month after month. And this is really where Barack Obama's policies get out of whack. In June of 2014, Israel begins a genocide of Palestinians.